Hello and welcome to today's video. This video takes a different format to the sort of thing I normally do. In fact, this is an interview which happened in 1948 between August Wollenhaupt, who was Adolf Hitler's hairdresser, and Michael Mussmano, who was then researching Nazi Germany. Now, August Wollenhaupt was born in 1885, and as you will hear in this interview, he had nothing to do with the Nazi Party, but he liked Hitler. He was not accused of anything after the war. Obviously, cutting Hitler's hair was not a crime. However, in February 1948, he did get sentenced to 30 days in prison, and that was because he refused to fill out a questionnaire, and he said he'd filled out enough questionnaires and he was sick of it, and the military tribunal gave him that 30 days in prison. But that was after several requests for him, please begging him to do it. Anyway, he didn't. Now, Michael Mussmano was the son of impoverished immigrants from southern Italy into the United States. He went on to study law, and he, in 1947, was the presiding judge at the Einsatzgruppen Trial. He stayed on in Germany. He conducted interviews with a number of people who had known Hitler, and in 1950 he published a book based on his research. And in what I'm now going to read to you is the interview he had with August Wollenhaupt. And obviously I've got to do two voices, but this is just a slightly abridged version. So Michael starts off by, I hope it's all right to call him Michael, the Judge Michael. When did you first meet Adolf Hitler? And August responds, I first actually saw him in 1929 in Berlin. He was then just a young politician, and he happened to be leaving a bakery as I was walking in. I looked at him because I recognized him. He gave me quite a piercing stare. After that, I attended a speech of his, and I have to confess, he was quite something up there. Michael asks, were you a Nazi Party member? No, I never joined the party. I was always apolitical. Hitler never asked me about my politics. We never talked about those things. It sounds strange to never discuss politics with a politician, but that's the way it happened. So let's talk about your first actual meeting with Hitler. This was in early 1932. My barber shop was in the Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin. This was a sort of headquarters for the Nazis. They all stayed there in the early 30s. Goebbels, in fact, lived there for a while. I cut Goebbels' hair, and he was always talking about Hitler. One day in January 1932, I said to Goebbels, you should let me cut his hair. It was just said in jest, but several weeks later, Goebbels introduced me to Hitler. Goebbels came back a few weeks later saying, this is Hitler. Oh, and by the way, Hitler didn't stay at the Kaiserhof when he was in Berlin. He always stayed at the Hotel Sans Souci. Well, tell me about this hotel. Why did he stay there instead of the Kaiserhof? The Hotel Sans Souci was a small bed and breakfast with only around 70 rooms. It was on Linkstrasse 37 and very modest. It was far less luxurious than the Kaiserhof. Hitler always liked it because it was modest, quiet, and he was not too bothered by anybody else there. It was a sort of artist hotels, and that appealed to the bohemian in Hitler. Now return to your first meeting, please. Hitler was very nice, affable, and gave off a modest demeanor. He was soft-spoken, which shocked me because my experience with him as an orator was that he was screaming in a hoarse manner. In person, he wasn't like that in the least. I liked him, and that never changed. Hitler was always quite friendly and approachable with me. I went home and told my friends that evening I'd met Hitler and I'd quite liked him. Maybe you can't understand that, but I'm being direct here. So how long was it before you cut Hitler's hair? How did you come into his service? Well, That's easy to tell you. After Goebbels brought me to Hitler, he then asked me if I could go to the Hotel Sans Souci later on to meet Hitler and possibly to cut his hair. I did have clients that I went to instead of them coming to me, so I took this as being quite normal. I assume that is because Hitler didn't want to sit in a public barber shop. Exactly. It was a security issue as well. The Nazis and communists at that time were killing each other in the streets. So I went to the Sans Souci and I went up to Hitler's room. He opened the door himself. He was alone. He asked me about myself and my family, which I appreciated. He was always very polite in such things. He was always very correct in his manners. Did you cut his hair then? No, we just talked. Hitler wanted to know my schedule, if I was able to travel to see him and all those sorts of things. I told him, of course, I couldn't leave my shop at the Kaiserhof. I will never forget what he said to me then. When I come to power, you can travel anywhere I go when I need your services. On his next trip to Berlin, I cut his hair for the first time. I went to the Sans Souci, took the lift up to Hitler's room, and went about my business. Michael asks, it was said that Hitler was afraid of scissors and razors. That's just a myth. I really do have to laugh at such things. It's true that Hitler didn't like an open straight razor near his throat, but I only shaved him for several days, and that was after the attempt of his life in 1944. Did Hitler give you instructions on his hair? He really didn't do that. Even prior to the first time I cut his hair, he told me, don't change my style, don't cut too much. That was all. I attempted to try and tame his forelock, but he would have none of it. I personally thought he looked more pleasing without the forelock, but he said he wanted that to stay. I used scissors on most of his hair, and around the neck and ear area I used the electric razor. I can tell you that I used a Jakob Schick electric razor, which had only then been recently available. This razor was brought out in 1929. Hitler took a keen interest in my electric razor. He was very captivated by it and the sound it made. He was a superb mimic, and whenever we'd meet, he would almost always make the bzzz sound because he knew I would use that razor. I would also trim his moustache. Usually Hitler attended to this himself, and I have to say, he sometimes did a pretty poor job. Because he was right-handed, it was difficult for him to get to the side of his moustache. I talked to him about this, and I even showed him how to do this in front of a mirror, but he never seemed to get the hang of it. Michael says, Hitler's secretary told me that he hated being touched. Did this also occur to you? Never. Of course I had to touch him in order to cut his hair and to tend to him when that needed doing. I never had the feeling he was timid in this way. He was not a familiar man, but he was friendly and approachable within certain limits. Michael asks, how would you describe Hitler's looks? Did he look the same in person as he did on photos or newsreels? August says, I think he looked quite fine. He had very nice skin, unblemished and milky white. He was very fair-skinned. Of course, his famous eyes lived up to their reputation. He had extremely attractive eyes. That was his best feature. His hair was very fine and very soft. He washed it every day himself, as he told me. He kept himself very clean and very fresh. He was just that sort of man, very clean and well-groomed. Goebbels was the same way, but he smoked and would smell of cigarettes. Hitler was pleasant all round. Hitler hated smoking, we've been told. Oh yes, he did. He hated smokers, and he would talk to me about this on many occasions. There were a few things he hated more than smokers and smoking. He always told me, what a disgusting habit. After Hitler assumed power, did you start travelling with him? Not at first. In 1933, he spent a lot of time in Berlin, and he summoned me to the Reich Chancellery for his haircuts. Sometimes I would get a call at my home at 1 a.m, and I'd have to go over and give him a trim. Hitler wanted his haircut every 2 weeks. He told me that as a young man in Vienna, when he was poor and struggling, His dream was someday to be able to afford a haircut every 2 weeks. He used to have his hair cut by himself. Many a time he said to me, he disliked Vienna and would mock the Viennese accent. Like I said, he was a very good mimic. So when did you start travelling to cut Hitler's hair? Gradually, by late 1934, this happened more and more. But that was not all the time. Hitler's schedule before the war was generally about 12 days in Berlin, 8 days in Munich, a few days travelling and the remainder on the Obersalzberg. It was really only when he started staying longer periods at the Berghof that I had to travel with him. How many times were you at the Berghof? Not until 1935 or 36. After that, many times. Maybe 30 times I was there, possibly less, possibly more. I was so impressed there and I look forward to my times there. It was such a tragedy it was all bombed. Every time you were there you cut Hitler's hair? Of course. That was the service I provided to him. I was there in his presence to perform a task and I did so. I also cut the hair of some other men, the guards, SS men and so forth. Did you ever cut the hair of Eva Braun? That would never have happened, and it's an amusing suggestion. If you'd ever been around Eva Braun, you would know that she had her hair cut professionally styled, tinted and coiffed. She would probably have perished first before letting me touch her hair. I didn't know her well, but I met her many times and we chatted sometimes. I saw her in Berlin seldom, and then not only really until the start of the war, maybe a little earlier. She was always there when Hitler was at the Berghof. I saw her there often. Did you ever see Eva Braun in Munich? You mean in Hitler's apartment? I was there occasionally, and always prior to the war. I saw her there once, I believe. Yes, it was once. She was attractive, a very attractive, pretty girl. She was modest like Hitler, liked to laugh, could be buoyant and jolly. A modern girl, athletic and sporty. She always had her girlfriends with her. From what I saw of her, I liked her very much. I saw Hitler and Eva together. They behaved very well towards each other. I had the sense that her presence relaxed Hitler. He seemed jollier when Eva Braun was around. That was my perception. Their relationship, of course, was secret. It was don't see, don't tell when it came to them. For instance, I never told anyone, not even my family, about the existence of Eva Braun. You ask how they behaved? I would say normally. They seemed like good friends, a father-daughter type of teasing relationship. They were not affectionate in front of others, and I was not one of his close circle. I was just the barber. They maintained the facade of merely being friends. The close circle knew better though. Hitler mentioned Eva Braun rarely, and only then in the later years. He said once that Eva took more time on her hair in one morning than he had taken in 50 years. Things like that. In 1943 and 1944, he spoke of her more often and with great warmth and tenderness. He wouldn't say anything specific. He just had a great deal of warmth in his voice when he would mention her. I had the sense that he'd grown more fond of her as the years passed. He gave indications that he loved her. He was not demonstrative really, but the fact she was by his side for so many years tells me he was devoted to her. He was not a man incapable of tender feelings. He loved children, he liked to look at pretty girls, he had all the normal weaknesses and feelings of most people. Did you have the feeling he was faithful to her? I wasn't around him enough to make a judgment on that. However, based on my personal interactions with Hitler, I would say he was not the type of man to play around with women. His position made that practically impossible anyway. But what about Leni Riefenstahl or the Unity Midfit? Hitler was merely friends with those two ladies. There was no romance with anyone after he met Eva Braun. I don't have personal knowledge of this, but I knew people in Hitler's circle and they told me this many times. Did Goebbels talk about Hitler and Eva Braun? No, that would never have come up. He wouldn't have discussed anything about the Führer's private life with me. What would Hitler talk to you about when he was in the barber's chair? Oh, he loved gossip. This is something not generally known, but Hitler loved to gossip about actors, musicians, famous people. He liked to know who was cheating on who and with whom, such things as that. I knew no Munich gossip, but knew everything about Berlin, and he revelled in that. He liked to whistle and was a superb mimic. He could imitate anyone, their voice, their walk. Did you suggest that Hitler change his hairstyle? I stopped suggesting anything after 1935. He asked me to stop nagging about his forelock and let it be. So I did, and laid the matter to rest. He sometimes teased me before I began cutting his hair. Now don't tamper with this, and he would grab his forelock. I think he thought he looked dashing in it. He wanted his hair cut so the forelock would dangle on his forehead during speeches. Did Hitler have grey hair? Yes, quite a bit at the end, also in his moustache by that time, by 1944. Prior to that, he had a little grey hair, although his whiskers started to become grey around 1942. You said you shaved him only twice. When was that? It was after the July the 20th bomb plot. I had been at the Wolfschanze in Rastenburg many times. I positively hated going there, but one couldn't ignore a summons from Hitler. It was then that I had to shave him for several days. He was quite old looking by then, and he'd been banged up pretty good in the bombing. His hair stood up like a porcupine, so I didn't cut his hair, but I shaved him. That was quite difficult. I used a straight razor. I always used that. Hitler was accustomed to a blade razor and was uncomfortable with being shaved. One day he wanted to skip, but then he looked visibly unshaven, and this just wouldn't do for the Führer. I noticed for a very brief time that he also had dandruff. He told me that in the early 1920s he had suffered with dandruff, but that Heffelstangl had given him a special shampoo and it had never reoccurred. Were you afraid of cutting Hitler? No, I'd shaved 100,000 faces by then. I knew my job. Hitler trusted me, but didn't like anyone to shave him, except himself. What was the longest Hitler ever went between haircuts? Once it was a month. That was in 1935. I don't recall why this happened, but his hair was much longer than usual when I got to him again. He always tipped me 2 Reichsmarks when I cut his hair, even though I received adequate compensation from Bormann's account. I thought that was a nice touch. A sentimental remembrance of when he'd been a private man and I had first cut his hair. He always asked me about my family, took a keen interest in me personally, and was always polite. You never saw him in a rage? No, and I doubt he ever had one. I saw him patient sometimes, never angry. When he'd get impatient, he would snap his fingers in an increasingly rapid tempo. He was always calm and polite with me. I just can't dismiss these raging stories out of hand. When was the last time you cut Hitler's hair? It was not in the bunker. I never knew of its existence. My last haircut for the Führer was in early March 1945. He was visibly trembling, old and a complete shell of what he had once been. It was a horrible sight. He was the walking dead. So I hope you've found that of interest. Now, I often mention the film Downfall, and you can sort of see the Hitler that's shown in the Downfall, except for the Fegelein scenes and the rage scenes. But you can see that when he's being polite to others, and this comes out in this interview with his barber. And indeed, it would seem that many people, particularly the ladies, thought that Hitler was quite charming. So clearly, you've got a person with at least 2 sides to his character. So thanks very much for listening. This is a complete one-off, but I thought this interview was so interesting when I came across it that I'd like to share it. I wanted to share it with you. So anyway, I upload at least once a week, and if it's only once a week, it's going to be on a Friday at 2000 hours at 8 in the evening, Central European time. That's where I am, and I hope you'll subscribe. All the best from me.